Hello and welcome to Pagabo Live, a brand new initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name's Tom, and over the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be guiding you through changes to the Building Safety Act with the help of a series of expert voices.
Good afternoon, my name is Richard Glazard. I head up Health and Safety Services for the London South East region for AtkinsRéalis.
Good afternoon, my name is Graham Whitty. I'm the National Product Director for Willmott Dixon, and I drive compliance and conformity in our business.
Thank you both. So let's have a quick run through of what today's event will actually entail. So Richard and Graham are going to run through a bit of background on the Building Safety Act and then go on to the regulation changes for all buildings, the key questions that have jumped out and hopefully some answers to them, including the implications on time, cost, and of course, higher risk buildings. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session where we'll be joined by Pagabo's Director of Frameworks, Jonathan Oram. So please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll hopefully have around 15 minutes at the end to run through audience questions. We're also going to be running through a series of flash polls this afternoon throughout the event. So if you have you'll have around 30 seconds to answer each of those, and they'll help inform the discussion we're having today and also give a better idea of where you are in your kind of journey of understanding. And actually, without further ado, we've got the first poll here. So if we can get that poll live. The question is, would you say that your organisation is prepared for the changes to the Building Safety Act? And it's a scale of 1 to 4 of preparedness, where 1 is not prepared at all and 4 is incredibly well prepared. I'm not sure why I bothered to sign up to this webinar. So if we can just quickly go through those, we've got around 30 seconds to answer them, and we'll also be asking this question at the end, where hopefully you've moved in the right way on the scale and hopefully things have become ever so slightly clearer to you. Just another 10 seconds on that poll. Brilliant. If we could close that poll now, please. So looking at the results, there's a couple there that were kind of in the kind of middle range. Fortunately, not too many of you are completely unprepared, so that's a good start. But a few in the lower end, around over half actually in the lower end of understanding. So hopefully today's webinar will give you a bit more understanding and take you further along that journey, as we said. So I guess that's probably about time to start off. So if we could hand over to you, Richard, for today's presentation.
Thanks, Tom. And, from that poll, it was very interesting. I think, the one thing hopefully you'll come away from this today with is a high-level overview of the Building Safety Act and the implications of it. It's a broad, far-reaching piece of legislation that looks to change how we design, construct, manage buildings in the construction environment, particularly high-risk buildings. There's a big focus on those, but it actually impacts all buildings. And I think that's probably that the attention's been on higher risk buildings over the last few years, but there are impacts on all buildings. So just to give you a start, just to give you a bit of an overview of the history of the Building Safety Act, where it's come from, and the progression that we've had over the last few years. So we obviously started with the Grenfell Tower tragedy in June 2017, where 72 people lost their lives. And often it takes a tragedy or a major event to change how we do things societally. So less than a year after that, we had Dame Judith Hackett produce the Hackett Report, which put forward over 50 recommendations to do with how we construct, design, manage higher risk buildings in the building environment. But I think it opened up a broader question about all buildings within the building environment, within the built environment. August 2021, we had the introduction of Gateway 1. So the Gateway processes had already been seen as sort of a destination where they wanted to go with the Building Safety Act. So the Gateway 1 was implemented via an amendment to town and country planning legislation. We'll come on to that in a little while. We then had the introduction of the Building Safety Act. We had the Building Safety Bill, which was consulted on by a lot of people throughout the industry. Quite a long process. Which then led to the Building Safety Act in 2022. And the bit that we were sort of waiting for between April 2022 and October 23 was the secondary legislation. There was a lot of consultation documents that went out that we responded on, and a lot of others responded on about what they were going to include within the secondary legislation, how it's going to look. But we were all sort of really waiting for that detail before we could really start to plan how we were going to do things within the industry, and especially within our business as well. So that came in October 23. We didn't get a lot of time to look at that between sort of it landing on the statute or the draft statute book, I suppose, August last year, and then being published in October. In between that, there were a lot of other things that happened as well. Just to note a few things, the ban on combustible cladding on buildings over 18 metres in 2018. That was a prescriptive ban on cladding, which is not always usual within legislative frameworks. So, the introduction of sprinklers to residential buildings over 11 metres in 2020. And then there were also introductions of, consistency and wayfinding on floors within buildings as well. So there were other changes around building regulations. We had the introduction of the Fire Safety Act, which brought sort of more common areas within buildings into the requirements for fire risk assessments by responsible buildings for those responsible persons for those buildings. So it covered a lot more of the building in the fire risk assessment stage, which, if I'd say one thing about the Building Safety Act and all the secondary legislation is, if there's ever a point at which you're not sure of where you're going with it, go back to Grenfell Tower. A lot of these things are things that have come out of the inquiry and the recommendations that Dame Judy Packard put forward. Earlier this year, we saw, last year, we saw the question mark over second staircases in buildings over 18 metres, which Michael Gove then brought down to 11 metres. And I believe there's a 30-month consultation period on that at the moment. 30 metres, and it's been brought down to 18 metres. So if we're honest, we're still looking at where that's going at the moment. So that's a sort of a quick overview of the Building Safety Act and its history today. So the Building Safety Act itself came in last 2022. As I say, we were waiting for that secondary legislation, but the Building Safety Act itself is a piece of primary legislation that overhauls and amends existing primary legislation, so the Building Act, the Architects Act, and so on. It also introduces new secondary legislation that comes under that, around the building regulations, which we'll come on to in a moment. The Act itself enables the introduction of the Building Safety Regulator on a free statutory body, so the Construction Products Regulator, the New Homes Ombudsman, and the Building Safety Regulator themselves. We'll come on to those. Come on to the Building Safety Regulator in a moment. Introduces a requirement for resident engagement strategy. So for in-occupation buildings, accountable persons must have in place a strategy for engaging with residents within buildings, and more broadly within the country, people that are living in higher risk buildings. There is now a resident engagement committee that must be consulted on if there are changes to building safety regulations, or they must be consulted about general queries to do, I think, with building safety environment. So powers of remediation and redress, so the building liability orders have been introduced, prohibitions on new developments for developers that aren't going to go back and fix any problems or redress issues with previous developments around cladding and so on. As I said, the establishment of New Homes Ombudsman that will act as a third party between new homeowners and developers. New home warranties, so new homes need to be warranted for up to 15 years. Greater enforcement powers for the Building Safety Regulator as well. So it's a bit like building control, but with the powers of the Health and Safety Executive as well rolled in to one. So duties for construction and management of higher risk buildings as well. So this introduction of accountable persons, registrations of buildings that we'll come on to in a little while. And as I say, registration of higher risk buildings. So this is something that we saw last year, as of April last year, with the requirement of owners of high risk buildings to register their buildings by the October last year and provide key building information. So as I say, the Building Safety Act itself introduced a lot of secondary legislation. I think there were 17 pieces we looked at that probably impacted the way that we construct and design the building control process on all buildings. But the key thing about the Building Safety Act is, as I said before, it actually impacts all projects that we work on. We've split this presentation into two parts, so all projects and higher risk buildings. 17 pieces of legislation. You've got the building control aspects which impact all buildings, particularly the building regulation amendment regulations, which introduce new duty holders and so on, and then the high risk buildings, which introduces the new process for high risk buildings for managing high risk buildings for buildings in occupation. But the best way to think about it, I think, effectively, is that it impacts at one level all projects, And then the high risk buildings element of it impacts where we manage high risk buildings, where we design and construct occupied high risk buildings, and we're doing work to existing high risk buildings, and where we're occupying. Sorry, can you go back one slide? where we're constructing new high risk buildings, managing high risk buildings, and changes to existing high risk buildings. So first, we're going to look at all buildings and the impacts of the Building Safety Act on all buildings. So the building regulation amendment regulations are new regulations that they impact the existing building regulations and the Building Act. The key changes apply to all projects where more than one contractor is appointed. So there are new duties for clients, designers and contractors, new duty holders, including the principal designer and the principal contractor, same names but different duties to those under CDM, slightly similar, but we'll come on to the difference in a moment. Greater requirements to demonstrate competency for all. Competency is probably a key part of the Building Safety Act and the changes that we see in the secondary legislation. New duties to ensure the supervision and monitoring of those working on projects, but still in training as well. So if we go back to Grenfell Tower and we think about some of the project managers that were potentially working on some of those projects that were quite young, didn't necessarily have the right experience. And then we look at competence and we look at the experience of the architects that were working on Grenfell Tower. Their experience hadn't traditionally come from working on that type of building. It had come from schools and so on. So this is about making sure that the people that are working on the project, people that are designing the projects have got experience, skills, knowledge to be able to do that. And they've got the right behaviours as well, which we'll come on to. So key thing about this really is if you're building anything from a residential home to a new leisure centre or making changes to an existing high-risk building through to building a new high-risk building, the building regulation amendment regulations apply. As I said earlier, there's a bit of a big focus on high-risk buildings, and it's probably lost the fact that this actually applies to all buildings. So get on to the next slide, please. So duties of clients under the building regulation amendment regulations, they must make suitable arrangements for planning, managing and monitoring the project, including the allocation of sufficient time and other resources so as to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. The language is very similar to that of CDM 2015, but the terminology you'll see at the end there is with all relevant requirements, and we'll come on to what that means in a moment. So the arrangements are suitable if the design work carried out, if built, would be in compliance with all relevant requirements, ensure building work is carried out in accordance with all relevant requirements, and enable designers and contractors to cooperate with each other, as well as providing enough time for them to be able to complete their elements of work that they need to do. The arrangements need to be managed throughout the project. Clients must provide building information as soon as practicable to every designer and contractor. So, effectively pre-construction information, it's survey information, it's relevant information to be able to assist the designer in actually making decisions about the design, and the same with the contractor in order to help them make decisions about how they're going to plan the work. Where there's more than one contractor, or it's reasonably foreseeable that there'll be more than one contractor, they must appoint a designer with control over the design work as the principal designer for the purposes of these regulations, and again, not the CDM regulations, but these regulations, and a contractor with control over the building work as the principal contractor for the purposes of these regulations as well. So it is separate to the CDM regulations, but principal contractors and principal designers under the building regulations, their roles are primarily to ensure, or their duties are to ensure, the arrangements are in place to plan, manage and monitor the design work and the building work for their respective parts, so as to ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. So both parties are required to ensure design work is being coordinated and good communication is being maintained throughout the project. So again, very similar to what they do with CDM, but the reliance here is on all relevant requirements. So principal designers can be undertaken, so that it can be undertaken by an individual or it can be undertaken by an organisation. Principal designer under CDM and under the building regulations can be the same party if they have the right skills, knowledge and experience to be able to undertake that role as both parts. If they are to undertake the role as an organisation, they need to make sure someone within the organisation is appointed to ensure that the organisation is fulfilling its duties as the principal designer. And they'd be the person that's responsible for effectively, I suppose, signing the building control certificate to say that they are the principal designer, or the notification to building control at the outset to say they are the principal designer. Again, like CDM, failure to appoint a PD or a PC at the project outset will result in the role defaulting to the client. So, Your designers should be making you, if you're a client, your designers and your contractors should be making you aware of your duties under the building regulation amendment regulations. And they should be briefing you enough to be able to help you, support you to be able to undertake that role. Granted, at the moment, everybody's a little bit in the dark about the roles, about the Building Safety Act and so on. So it's something that, as a client, you need to be aware of, because you don't want to default back into undertaking that role yourself if you're not consciously doing that. So the term all relevant requirements, effectively it means the legislative framework, I suppose, and the building regulation framework that applies to whatever it is you're constructing or building. So it could be all relevant sections of the building regulations, the approved documents, British standards, RRFO, CDM regulations 2015. So really on each project, the Building Safety Act or the Building Regulations PC and the Building Regulations PD should be assessing what relevant requirements apply to their project and what they need to do in order to comply with those requirements. So as I mentioned, so the CDM principal designer and the Building Regulations principal designer can be undertaken by the same organisation or separate organisations, but the key sort of differences, I suppose, between the two: Building Regulations principal designer's responsibility is planning, managing and monitoring and coordinating design work so that if it were built, it would be in compliance with all relevant requirements. So it's about building regulation compliance, compliance with approved documents and any other standards that apply to the project. It's the one part within the building regulations where it's not included within the terms and abbreviations and definitions. CDM principal design is planning, managing and monitoring and coordinating the pre-construction design phase so that if the project is carried out without risk to health and safety. Again, it can be undertaken by the same party, but as long as they've got the skills, knowledge and experience to be able to undertake both roles. Graham, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so we've been obviously got live projects going through our systems with our customers, and we're encountering from a contractor perspective a lot of confusion about this role, which obviously is named the same but has a very different function. So we're seeing people thinking that it is the same as the principal designer, an extension to that role, that it can be simply just passed down to the principal contractor. It should be part of their service to you as the customers. And unfortunately, there shouldn't be any additional fees attached to these new roles. And it is a difficult, it's a new role into the business, and it really hasn't founded itself well at the moment. But I hope you can realise, from Richard's presentation, that it is fundamentally different to the CDM role. It takes a certain skill level of competence of person and company to deliver those skill sets that don't currently exist in most main contractors and are effectively a specialism. We are seeing out there is a lack of competent people and companies who are willing to offer this role, especially when we're looking at higher risk buildings. So over 18 meters, 7 stories, 2 residential buildings. That's the definition. And the role on a HRB is really pumped up. It's a bit on steroids. It's an important role in the whole project team. Unfortunately, there aren't many organisations and companies willing to put themselves forward. That is primarily due to a lack of insurance at the moment. There isn't a great deal of insurance cover because insurance don't understand what the levels of risk and liability that these consultants are going to expose themselves to. Concerns and queries over the competency. So what competencies does a principal designer need to demonstrate and display, and can people evidence those competencies? And what the scope is. So what actually does that role entail? How are they going to work within an existing project team? It's clear that the regulations say that they must be part of the design team and able to influence and make changes and challenge where it needs to be. So they're not just a post box, they're we're seeing them as an integral part of the team. Our current view, the utopia, would be that this should be a direct appointment by the customer, which is where I think the envisagement when the health and safety executive were looking at setting up all this information, that's what the driver was behind it. And there's a few key reasons why we believe that should be so. One is that you can clearly separate the role of the principal contractor and the principal designer, and that avoids a potential any conflict of interest. If they sit both in the same camp, which is legally possible to do, there is a potential conflict within that business, and having them as separate roles by separate individuals and parties allows constructive challenge for the betterment of the project. It allows then the principal designer to assist the client to discharge their duties and advise them on their duties in that role. And it gives an impartial view on design compliance. So the principal designer is effectively free from some of the commercialities that the principal contractor will be sitting on their side of it. So you have that impartial view of what good design compliance looks like and potential routes for design. And that, we believe, will provide the client with some comforts, because the client has to make a declaration at the end of a project, both for a non-HRB project and a HRB project, a legal declaration, and to allow them to sign that declaration that the building has been designed and built properly. Having an impartial view from a PD who's outside of the principal contractor's sphere, I think, will give them a lot more comfort, enabling them to make that signature. So, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, it's an interesting world at the moment with this role of the principal designer. I think the industry, because the statutory the secondary legislation landed on the books with quite short notice. I'd say there's probably a lack of guidance and advice within the industry bodies at the moment. I know REBA are pedaling quite hard to get some information out there and support their members, and APS and CABE and CIOB, they're all pedaling quite hard to get that out there, but having the detail behind the secondary legislation has probably hampered that a little bit, I think. Standard forms of contract, standard scopes of services, sort of established fees, that sort of thing is probably sort of hanging back a little bit at the moment. The thing that's dragging out, I think, the approach in terms of appointment of a principal designer is, as Graham said, there's different perspectives on it as well within the industry. I'd say REBA's perspective is more that it would be the lead designer, the lead architect that's taking control of the design. And as I say, with this slide here, the Building Safety Act or the Building Regulations, principal designer can be a person or an organisation, but ideally there's someone that's in a position to influence and control the design work. So it's how that person or how that organisation sits within the design team, what controlling ability they have within the design. Again, suitably competent to ensure the BSA or the Building Regulations PD roles undertaken in accordance with the regulations. And PAS 8671 is the competence guide on the principal designer role, and the HSE's interpretation or comment on that was that it's an important that the principal designer is part of the design team and not a third party without any influence over design decisions. So it might be that you see this principal designer role, whereas maybe on CDM you've seen it, carry on throughout a project as being maybe the same party, but on projects, really, it's that person that's in the best position to control the design work. So it might hand over from one party, an architect or a design team, to a contractor during construction. Ultimately, it's about the project, to making sure the interests and safety of the building and the designer are put first. So it's who's in the best position for it, really. We've mentioned competence a lot. Skills, knowledge and experience, they've always been a requirement under CDM, and I think that refers to health, safety and everything that we do in construction anyway. It's probably a big part of most codes of conduct for most industry bodies. The addition that we've seen is behaviours. So, what behaviours are we looking for in design and in construction? People accepting work only if they're competent to be able to undertake that work. People, raising the flag if there's things happening on a project that don't seem right, that aren't correct, and that need to be raised to the forefront. So PAS 8671 is the Built Environment Framework competence for individual principal designers specifications, and 8672 for principal contractors. That comes off the back of the BSI Flex document, which is the framework for developing competence specifications for roles within the building safety or under the Building Safety Act. So hopefully, if you can flick onto the next slide, you'll see your industry bodies starting to produce information about competence and starting to support you. But go and have a look on their websites. There will be information there. CABE have started putting together their competency frameworks, started providing additional training, and CPD, as have REBA. I know the APS are providing CPD sessions and advice and guidance on the Building Safety Act. So transitional arrangements, I mean, effectively, if you had a project in for building control before October, and the work starts on site before April, and your building control notice was approved, then, as I understand it, the work can continue under the previous regulations, or how it have applied. This you don't need a new principal designer and a new principal contractor appointed under the building regulation amendment regs. If you had a building application went in after October, or it went in before October but it wasn't approved, and the work isn't going to start on site before April, then you need to look at adopting this new legislative framework and applying that to your project. There are further details on that within the building regulation amendment regulations. So I would urge you to go away and look at that or seek further guidance. This, as I said at the beginning, this is a broad, far-reaching piece of legislation, the Building Safety Act, and there are multiple pieces of regulations that have come out of it. So it's still a lot of reading to be done at the moment.
Thanks both. Before we move on to the piece about higher risk buildings, so we've got another flash poll for you. So if we could fire up that poll now, please. These are kind of some top concerns that when we were talking ahead of this webinar, we identified that Richard and that Graham had already heard from clients. So it'd be interesting to hear a wider perspective on this. What are your top concerns around these changes? So is it competency and understanding of terminology? Is it the levels of evidence required? The BSR impact on project timing and programming, and BSR's ability to resource and the knock-on impact of that, the delivery of the PD role, and any other concerns. If you do have any other concerns that you'd like to kind of be brought up, please put them in the Q&A box, because it'd be interesting to discuss those, because they are some of the key concerns that we saw so far. So if we could just have 10 seconds more on that poll and then close it off, and we'll see what the results are. So interestingly there, it's the competence and the understanding of terminology. And that's certainly, as somebody who's been reading up on this quite a lot, is the one thing that's throwing me quite a lot, is there's a lot of dual terminology there. So that's really interesting that the terminology has been the top kind of result there. 56% of people saying that the terminology is what's throwing them off. And the levels of evidence required, 33% have said that. And then also, interestingly, the 46 people, which is 42% of respondents, said the delivery of the PD role, which is something, looking at our audience Q&A questions, that we'll go into a little bit more once we go onto the Q&A session, which will be starting just after we go through the higher risk buildings. So with that, it's back over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, as I said, we split this presentation into two parts: all buildings and high risk buildings. So the key thing about high risk buildings is there is a more stringent and robust framework in from building control perspective and from building regulations perspective for managing how we design, how we build, how we procure high risk building work to existing high risk buildings and to new high risk buildings. There is a lot more regulation around how we manage occupied high-risk buildings as well. We're not going to touch on that too much today. But effectively, what is a high-risk building? It's a building at least 18 metres or more than 7 stories, whichever heights reached first, which contain 2 or more dwellings, so house, flat, service apartments, or 2 or more rooms used for residential purposes. It includes student accommodation. It also includes, during construction and during work to it, hospitals and care homes. In occupation, the Building Safety Act won't apply to them, but during construction it will, which is something that has come out of the high risk buildings descriptions regulations, which is a piece of legislation that outlines what is a high risk building. Because it may seem obvious, but when you're looking at overstation developments, when you're looking at high risk buildings that have got connected parts to the bottom of them and so on, that might need to be phased in their construction, it needs a bit of thinking about at times. So the measurement of the building is the height of the top story, excludes the rooftop plant areas and any top stories consisting exclusively of part rooms, and basement levels are excluded. So it's the description of a building as per the building regulations. So the building safety regulator, one of the big changes about the construction of high risk buildings and the works to existing high risk buildings is, previously, as identified within Dame Judith Hackett's report, you had the approved inspector route available to you and the local authority building control route for you available to you. That's no longer available if you're looking to construct a high risk building. The only building control body that you can go through for high-risk buildings is the building safety regulator. So they are effectively a statutory body that are supported by the Health and Safety Executive, originally part of the Health and Safety Executive. They've become the building safety regulator now, supported by LABC, building control, and other statutory consultees that you'd need to consult during the planning and building control process. Their function is securing the safety of people in or about buildings in relation to risks arising from buildings and improving building standards. Responsibilities are implementing and enforcing that more stringent regime for high-risk buildings, and they'll oversee performance of all high-risk buildings, both in construction and in occupation. Overseeing compliance with the Building Safety Act and other legislation relevant to safety for in-scope buildings. They'll have the authority to prosecute and issue fines and stop notices. They'll be responsible for facilitating the improvement of competence of all persons within the built environment. So they've already established a competency committee that are looking at competency within the industry bodies and how they set standards within the industry. They're responsible for establishing and managing a register of building inspectors and building control approvers. As we said earlier, there is already a register open from April last year that had to be completed by October to register existing high-risk buildings with the building safety regulator. So effectively, if you need to construct or do work to an existing high-risk building or construct a new high-risk building, you'll have to go through the building safety regulator as your building control body. For non-HRB work, you can still use LABC and approved inspector route. So those routes are still open to you. It's only for high-risk buildings. So additional duties under the Building Safety Act. So the high-risk buildings procedures, the buildings high-risk buildings procedures regulations outline additional duties for duty holders on high-risk buildings. These are just some of them. There's a lot of reading to be done on it. Client needs to make their designers and their team aware, the contractor aware, if they're asking them to do work on a high-risk building. As I said before, it's not always easy. As obvious as it being a new build high-risk building. In some cases, it might be rooms within an existing high-risk building that might not obviously be a high-risk building. Keep a record in writing of the steps that they took to ensure the competence of the building regulations principal designer and building regulations principal contractor. So they'll be asked as part of the gateway to confirm the competency of those parties that they've appointed, and they need to keep a record of what measures they took to ensure the competence of those parties. They need to register the high-risk building with the building safety regulator upon completion of the works as part of the completion approval application certificate at the end of the project before the building could be occupied. Building Safety Act principal designer needs to undertake inspections during construction phase to identify any safety occurrences. So again, going back to that point about who the principal designer might be from pre-construction through to construction or pre-contract through to post-contract. It might be that if you've got a contractor on board taking on the role of the BSA or the building regulations principal designer during construction, they might be undertaking that role. We've also heard, industry sort of speculating around this role of the clerk of works becoming more prominent within construction. So there's somewhere you might see that. Ensure the provision of necessary information for the golden thread prior to building control submissions, and provide a compliance statement to the client that they fulfilled their duties under the regulations, and that'll be a key part at the end of the project to confirm that the building, to the best of their knowledge, has been built in compliance with the building regulations and all relevant requirements. Principal contractors must create, maintain and change control log throughout construction phase. Managing change throughout the project would be pivotal and really important to get in handover. Providing compliance statements to the clients that they fulfilled their duties under the regulations, and ensuring the competence of their own supply chain and subcontractors. So a lot of focus has probably been on competence within the design and the architectural and the engineering and the construction and the principal designer element, but it actually impacts the supply chain as well. So people that the principal contractors are putting to work on their projects as part of their supply chain. So that's a key part as well. So the introduction of gateways to the high-risk buildings and to the construction or to work to existing high-risk buildings is a key part of the Building Safety Act as well. As we talked earlier, the Gateway 1 introduction came in 2021. This was the requirement to provide a fire statement at the pre-planning stage. And that needs to take into consideration local plans, site layout, emergency vehicle access, water supplies, sufficient pressure for fire hydrants, consideration of principles and concepts and approach to fire safety for each development. It's not a fire strategy at that stage, but it needs to show that there has been given enough thought to how the building will be managed and built in terms of fire going forward. So Gateway 2, this is a hard stop before construction work starts, and there's a requirement there as part. It's normally the point at which you deliver your building control plans to building control. You would be delivering them to the building safety regulator, and there's a requirement there to provide a number of prescribed documents, including the necessary building control plans, competence declarations for the principal contractor and the principal designer, construction control plans. So what approved documents are you using during construction or as part of the design? How are they being used and how are they being checked? Change control plans, so how are you going to manage change in the design or during construction? Building regulations compliance statement, by an emergency fire and a partial occupation strategy. So if you have a building that's going to be handed over in multiple phases, it might need to be handed over, there might need to be a partial occupation strategy in place. Prior to Gateway 2, during design, we need to have in place this golden thread of information, which Graham's going to talk a little bit about in a moment. But at this stage, effectively, Gateway 2, this is a submission to the building safety regulator of your prescribed documents and your design, and there needs to give them enough confidence that what's been designed is what is going to be built and it is compliant with the building regulations. If you want to change the design after that, it needs to go back to the building safety regulator for review if it's considered a major change, and that's a 6-week review period. Gateway 2 is a 12-week review period. So there's a lot of talk in the industry at the moment about at what point do you go to Gateway 2? What point do you hand this information to them? And what does this do to procurement? I know that the building safety regulator came out the other day and said this, puts an end to the single stage D&B. This is design then build, not design and build. It's about getting surety of design and then being able to control change beyond that to make sure that it's safe and there aren't just changes made on site or as part of the sort of last minute design process. So that bit between Gateway 2 and 3, before you start work on site, you need to give the building safety regulator notice that you're going to start on site, and it needs to be 5 days in advance. And I think you need to have notified them after you've started on site as well. It's going to be integral to make sure there's robust record keeping and requirements to prove design, prove what you've built is in compliance with what you agreed with the building safety regulator at Gateway 2 for handover. Principal contractor needs to manage construction quality as part of that, mandatory occurrence reporting requirements, supply chain competence requirements, notification to the building safety regulator before and after starting work. Apologies, there's a typo there. It says building BSE. So again, during construction, the continued development of the golden thread of information, PD requirement to visit site and assess the building work to ensure it's in line with the design. And at Gateway 3, we need to be providing information back to the building safety regulator as part of the approval application, the building control approval application process. And that is an 8-week process as well. So ideally, what information you're providing to the building safety regulator at the end of the project needs to be accurate, and it needs to reflect what has been built and what was agreed at Gateway 2. You'll need to get that completion certificate as part of that building control process to be able to then register your building with the building safety regulator before you can occupy the building. Change control, as we mentioned, major changes outlined within the building safety high-risk buildings regs. Major changes, some of them are quite obvious, change or increase or decrease the external height of the proposed higher risk building. That's quite a big change. But then other things that may stand out a little bit more. So a change to an existing wall of a proposed higher risk building, including a wall tie, a wall restraint fixing, or wall system, support system in the wall, or where the building is part of the building is not occupied during the work. The change proposing occupation before all work is completed. So again, that thought process around, are you going to partially try and occupy the building before it's completed, before it's finally completed? And if you need to do that, you need to demonstrate to the building safety regulator how you're going to do that safely. Major changes to an existing HRB. So these are existing ones. So 6-week review period again. Change to the number of flats, residential rooms or commercial units contained within the HRB. Again, that changed the existing wall, including wall ties and wall restraint fixing systems. So notifiable changes that you need to make the building safety regulator aware of, that would incur a sort of 10-day notice period. Change to the change control plan, change to the number of dimensions of openings in any wall or ceiling or other part of the building or element for any pipe, duct or cable. So as you can see from these types of changes, then be able to demonstrate that your change log was up to date and it was accurate at the end of the project, so that when the building safety regulator go on site, review what's been built, it matches what you've got in your change log, and there aren't any differences between the design that it got submitted at Gateway 2 and what's been given to them at Gateway 3. Handover, as I said, at handover, you'll need to provide a number of pieces of information. So details of the principal designers, the principal contractors and the clients. So again, you might have had more than one principal designer on the project, so you need to provide the details of each one principal designer. Description of the work, the location, the intended use of each story. So an overview of what's been built, statement signed by the client confirming the building complies, or the building and the design complies with the building regs to the best of their knowledge. Information that's compliant with Regulation 38 of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. That information needs to be provided to the client, needs to be confirmation that's provided to the client's received it and the client's happy with it. The prescribed documents from Gateway 2, a compliance declaration from the principal designers and the principal contractors that to the best of their knowledge have been built in compliance with all building regulations. And importantly, all information that needs to be provided in as-built status as well. So the golden thread of information is effectively it's started with one thing, I think, within the industry, and it's taken a direction at the moment. And hopefully Graham will be able to speak a little bit more about this. But effectively, it's an electronic environment to store information, key information about the building. Should be an uneditable audit trail of design decisions that were made about the building that will live with the building throughout its life cycle. But do you want to talk a little bit more about the golden thread, Graham?
Yeah, if I just quickly go out to handover, then I'll go on to the golden thread. So I hope you can appreciate from Richard's notes there that there's a significant increase in the sheer amount of information required at the handover than previously required, and we see this as being a much more involved process. So it's not just all of the contractor handing over information to the client and then the big dump of 20 folders at the end of a project. There needs to be quite a managed process worked out between all the parties of how this information is going to be collated, when's it going to be collated, who's going to be checking it, who's going to be receiving it, how's it going to be verified, and etc. And there are other parties involved. So the accountable person, which is obviously for the HRBs, and the responsible person, which is for all buildings. So as Richard notes there, the information complies with Regulation 38. We now have an obligation to make sure that the receiving party has seen and verified the information that they're going to get. So there's a whole sequence of information being submitted, reviewed, before being accepted, before you can actually complete and hand over a building. So our initial or usual experiences of how we finish a project and hand over from contractor to customer and get the building into operational phase are going to have to be really looked at hard, because there are some hard stops in there. With HRBs, you cannot legally occupy the building until you have the completion certificate. Non-HRBs, it's a little bit grey. There's no legal thing stopping you occupying a building without a completion certificate, but there's risk involved there. Would a client accept possession of a building that doesn't have a completion certificate, but all the information has been submitted and everyone signed their declarations? All these things are up in the air, and on projects can cause significant delays. We're looking at an 8-week process, potentially 8 weeks. And in our interactions with the regulator on HRBs, it's that the more work and the more effort you put in during the project and going up to your Gateway 3 submission at the end of it, the quicker it's going to take the regulator to review and approve. On a non-HRB, if you're using building control or local, an approved inspector, which you still can do, the regulator is now overseeing those building control bodies. They're going to be asking the building control body, what did you do to satisfy yourself that the information you were presented at handover and completion was accurate and correct? They're not just going to accept a load of certificates and big wadge of information coming across from a contractor. They need to have demonstrated that they've looked at and reviewed it. That won't happen overnight. We have to submit all the all the information, a lot of it's compressed at the end of a project and hand it over. It has to be looked at, reviewed, digested before it agreed. So the current acknowledged route is completion certificates. Completion information gets collated and handed over and handed to building control. And usually the next day you get an email saying, here's your completion certificate. I don't see that happening going forwards unless you're on very simple projects and you've done a lot of it. On a HRB, I don't think you've got any chance of that happening. So we're going to have to change the way that we work as a combined team to make sure that we've got all of our information, all of our ducks in a row, coming up to that handover and completion process. We all understand our relative responsibilities and obligations to get it into the regulator and get the projects passed. And then projects have, HRBs have to be registered. Another separate process, another entity has to register the building after completion, which is a legal requirement on the customer. And this is going to take us to review how we are programming and resourcing the end of a project and the systems and processes that we are going to use, which sort of leads me on to the golden thread. So during a normal design process, the golden thread or the information is usually stored within our common data environment as a contractor, usually on a D&B contract with our designers, doing their design verifications and changes and approving drawings and information as we go through, which is all verified. You then come to the handover. All that information gets handed to the client. You then have to make, or the principal accountable person going forwards, the person who has occupational responsibility for that building, have to maintain that information in perpetuity throughout the building's life. So instead of it's the contractor's systems being the driving factor, it's really the end user's systems, the client systems, saying this is the way that we're going to store and manage our information, and we need to be handing over to those parties in the correct format to make life a lot easier for everyone. So we need to have an understanding of who's going to be managing the building and those responsible parties at the start of a project rather than at the end of it, to enable us to continue this golden thread information. What the golden thread actually contains at a level of detail is still subject to a lot of debate and discussion, and that's causing us all sorts of problems, with lots of parties entering the affray with their solutions and systems and their view of what good looks like. And I'm happy to be corrected, but I haven't seen yet a really clear descriptive set of information that says this is what the golden thread must contain. This is going to be one of these developing things as we go through and progress with our projects, and we'll have to work out and agree with our clients what we believe that golden thread needs to contain at the end of the project to allow them to operate and maintain it, and enough information that demonstrates to a regulator of how you control the design going forwards, that you ended up building what you set out to do at the front. Okay.
Thanks, Graham. So just, very quickly, a recap. I mean, like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of legislation to go and read, to take in, to understand, to digest. Effectively, take anything away from this, it applies to all buildings that the building regulations apply to. The key differences being the building regulation, building control bodies you've got available to you. If you're doing a HRB, it's just the building safety regulator. You've still got LABC or approved inspector for non-HRB work. Projects where there's more than one contractor will require a principal designer and a principal contractor appointed under the building regulation amendment regulations 2023. New projects shouldn't start until you've made your client aware of their new duties under the Building Safety Act. There's a requirement to appoint the principal designer for both CDM and building regulations. The PD can be one person or an organisation. If they're an organisation, they need to appoint someone responsible for discharging their duties of the PD. But again, it comes down to skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. If you've got one organisation doing that, they need the skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours to undertake both roles. And as construction professionals, the closing remark would be that we all have a personal responsibility to review, understand the impact of the Building Safety Act and the secondary legislation that's come out of it. So I'd urge you all to go away and look at it today if you haven't spent a bit of time looking at it, and think about how it's going to impact your services you're delivering, the roles you've got, and how your business operates at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Richard and Graham. Obviously, excellent presentation on a very complex topic, as you alluded to there, Richard, in your closing remarks. Our final flash poll is here as well, so hopefully there's a positive response, and hopefully people's sort of level of knowledge around it has improved over our sort of half an hour, 45 minutes that we've done here. If we just fire out the poll, thank you. While you respond to that, I'll actually bring in Jonathan Oram, who is Director of Frameworks at Pagabo. Jonathan, really insightful look there into where we stand with the Building Safety Act. I'm interested to know, and we've actually had a couple of questions on it, one from Stuart Sands, as to what Pagabo are kind of hearing in terms of the conversations you're having with contractors and consultants, but also clients as well. You know, what's the level of understanding you're seeing across the scope, really?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, just say thank you. Well, great presentation by Graham and Richard there. Really, really insightful on what is a very complex topic. From the conversation that we've been having to kind of just get a feel as to what's going on in the market with the clients and such, it is that level of confusion, understanding as to what actually, you know, it comes down to that PD role and that description, and the confusion risen by having the same title but two very different roles within the Building Safety Act and the CDM regs as well. So we're finding those kind of bits. It's just, we're all, I think that the industry as a whole are just trying to work their way through all of these changes, as Richard alluded to, and then you know, it's great that it's all been put in, but the guidance is still being developed. So until that's in place, it's going to be kind of not quite blind leading blind, but it's going to be really having to work very closely together to try and find out what is the best route, and those interpretations of those the regulations that we put in there to understand how that's going forwards.
Yeah, and you mentioned it there, Jonathan. The use of terminology was also something that was causing the most confusion with our audience in terms of the poll that we had earlier. And be good to go to you on this one, Graham, as well, because as Jonathan said, there's two separate roles with the same name, and you know that use of terminology. Is this something that is going to get better with time as people become used to it, or is there a real problem there with that particular issue, and also just wider people not necessarily understanding the terminology as well as they could do?
Well, yeah, there's always going to be that potential for misunderstanding with the same name. But in our business, we are calling them, you know, principal designer open brackets CDM and principal designer open brackets building regulations, and we are looking at them as two separate roles. They are two different skill sets currently. I believe the idea behind the similar convention is that the CDM world and principal designer world will eventually come together, and that whole building safety, health and safety sphere there will be professionals in that environment, and a new profession will emerge eventually. So they are, you know, they're creating that framework for that to happen. That's my view, whether that's right or not. But it is, at the moment, it is very difficult. They are very different competencies that not many individuals will have both competencies, I believe, that we're seeing out there. We're not seeing a lot of CDM practitioners at the moment holding their hands up and offering PD for building regulations roles. It's a different set of skills. It's not making life easy for us at the moment.
And on that kind of demonstration of competence side of things, a couple of questions have come in around this, and we'll push this one in your direction, Richard. Is this then, do you think, with kind of this need for a demonstration of competence, you say it sort of falls on everybody, but do you think there's going to be more focus on these kind of additional qualifications that people could do to show those competencies beyond the standard, you know, regulatory ones for their roles?
Yeah, I think, you know, we're looking at it as a business in terms of you know, not just qualifications, but how we've taken a fairly pragmatic look at the principal designer role as an organisation. As you know, we're one of the biggest organisations to design and professional services, you know, out there. So we've got the skills within the organisation. It's how we pull them together to be able to deliver that role, and how we can make sure that we're putting the right people on that project, and we've got access to the right people to provide that support to the people providing that principal designer role and on that project as well. But there is, for that one person that you have to appoint within the organisation, there is, I think, a greater requirement for them to have a broader knowledge of building regulations, of other framework, legislative frameworks that apply to what's being constructed. And again, it's proportion. So, you know, we work on everything from, you know, small school extensions and small, you know, refurbishments in schools, all the way up to, you know, multi-billion pound complex infrastructure projects. So it's making sure that, you know, we're not using people that are massively overly qualified and competent and experienced and stuff just to do the schools. We're just trying to make sure we target our people in the right direction. But I think CABE are offering some good guidance and some advice at the moment. REBA are as well. I think the industry bodies are starting to come along and getting in a position to be able to support their members a little bit more. But I think, that delay in the legislation, or not delay, but the late delivery of that legislation has probably not helped things much.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there. It's one of those things that has been coming down the track for a little while now, and it seems to be that we're just about catching up with it. Graham, just pass one towards you, actually. Danielle Booth has submitted a really interesting question, and I think we know the answer to it. But do you think that that Revit and BIM will help with the kind of the golden thread that's required?
Yes, undoubtedly. Obviously, the COBE data and Fiery, which is an extension of COBE data, will be sitting there and will form part of this golden thread of products and design elements in the business, and what those components are and how they're designed to perform. It is not the answer to everything. You can't BIM your way out of this level, and we've tried to implement BIM in our business for crikey, over 10 years now. And I don't think we're a whole lot further forward than we were when we started. It is not the answer to everything. It needs a whole scale uptake as to what this needs to look like going forwards. It will have a part to play, definitely, and good practitioners of it who have slick designs and integrated models and all the families and all the information data linking. Well, that will make life a lot more efficient going forwards. I do like the idea of standardized outputs as well. So can we all do things in a similar way as an industry, so that our customers are looking at the same information from, whether it's from us as a contractor or one of our competitors? There is a standard, and COBE does set that standard, but it's very heavy and cumbersome for certain things, so it's not very efficient.
Richard, we've had quite a few questions in about HRBs. We can't really get through to all of them in the remaining sort of 3 minutes that we have, but one that's kind of jumped out is around resourcing. And with everything falling to the building safety regulator now for HRBs, is there a risk there of a real big bottleneck? If it's, rather than going through 3 separate routes, it's now going through one. Surely real bottleneck there when at a time when resourcing isn't exactly we're not exactly flush with resource anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be absolutely honest. I don't know how the building safety regulator intend to resource it, or what the demand is with that at the moment. I know they're advertising. they're looking for people to join, but they're also, being supported. They're not, the building safety regulator aren't. They're themselves in their own entity. They are supported by, building control, local authority building control, and they've got access to other means of resourcing, I believe. So hopefully that assessment, that needs assessment of how they'll resource that, will be done, and they'll meet the demand. But yeah, I don't doubt, and I think this is probably one of the areas that I think a lot of concern was flagged early on about, how are they going to resource this? With the building control for non-HRBs, I understand from a recent building safety regulator conference they were chairing, they were saying they're not going to be overseeing that, they're just going to be using it. It's still down to the approved inspector and the LABC to do that. So at least that's that off there. It is, it's when you take into consideration all the recladding works that we've got to do across the country, all the upgrades and amendments you've got to do to the insides of buildings and so on. There is a lot of work out there, and I'll be interested to see how they resource that.
Yeah, it's probably one of the biggest questions around it. We're going to finish with just a quick one to you, Jonathan, just to ask how Pagabo can help on this front, and what Pagabo are looking to do with clients and also contractors and consultants to help them as this Building Safety Act comes in. I think you're on mute, Jonathan. Caught you.
Did. So to be saying, so the first thing we obviously do is hosting these types of webinars to make it our clients and spread the word around what is required, help other contractors and consultants as well be aware of what's going through, and it'll be to work with them to understand and make sure that everyone realizes what requirements are throughout from a client's point of view, to make sure that they do know what they need to be taking on when they're procuring the consultants and the contractors accordingly. And obviously some of the impact that has about the types of procurement that may be happening when you get into the contractor world as well. So it's going to be a fluid learning curve and development over the next 12, 18, 24 months as we progress.
Well, unfortunately, that's everything we've got time for today. Thank you to everybody that's tuned in. We have more than 250 people logging on at various points today. So obviously something that's a really big issue that people are needing some education on. And hopefully we've helped build a little bit of knowledge there. You're now all part of the Pagabo Live community, which is great. So you should be getting the invite to our next webinar, which will take place in February, which is on summer works. But you can keep an eye on pagabo.co.uk/Pagabo /Pagabo-live, get that one out, and we will be updating that with more detail on the speakers for the next one. There's also going to be a newsletter coming out around a week after each Pagabo Live session with a recording of the webinar in video and podcast form, so you can listen to it on the go if you so please. And there'll also be a few further insights from the team, and hopefully we'll get to some of the questions that we weren't able to get to today, given that we had more than 35 questions come in and only about 15 minutes to answer them. So hopefully you've enjoyed today and found it useful. If you have, tell a colleague, tell a friend, tell your mum if you want to, and we'll be back next month for another session. Thank you very much.